Excellent. Well, welcome everybody, and thanks so much for joining this webinar today from the Walkley Foundation. My name is Corinne Podger, and I am an independent consultant working with newsrooms on strategies to achieve social impact and financial stability. Today, we are digging into the new Race Reporting Handbook published last month. It was put together in a collaboration between the Australian Human Rights Commission and Media Diversity Australia as part of community consultations and submissions in the scoping work of the National Anti-Racism Framework. The framework identifies the need for more cultural safety, regulation, and representation in Australia's media landscape. So we have 4 speakers today to talk us through the handbook and how it can be used by Australian journalists. And I'm really thrilled to introduce, first of all, the handbook's authors. So Jenae, Tien and Karina Hogan. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Elias Clure, who's a reporter with the ABC's 7:30 program and who's based in Melbourne. Thanks for joining, Elias.
Hello.
And Mariam Veiszadeh, who's the former inaugural CEO at Media Diversity Australia. Mariam's about to join the Australian Institute of Company Directors to lead their board diversity strategy. Thanks so much for joining, Mariam.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So let's get started. Mariam, the Race Reporting Handbook happened under your wonderful watch at Media Diversity Australia. How did it come about?
Yeah, thank you. And yes, certainly reiterating and flagging that I have left MDA as of last week. So, but this opportunity to create the MDA Race Reporting Handbook did come about as the Human Rights Commission approached us a significant while ago now to create a racial literacy kit, because MDA had a disability reporting handbook and an Indigenous reporting handbook, which were created in consultation with those impacted communities. We felt it was a really good opportunity to create a race reporting handbook, which is something we wanted to do for a while but didn't have funding. And so we definitely took up the opportunity to do that and engaged Jenae, Tien and Karina Hogan as authors of this race reporting handbook. And that was how the journey started. And look, it also happened during a really difficult and polarizing time. So this project, has been, I guess, difficult to navigate. And I also am conscious the Human Rights Commission is actually, there's a whole host of things going on with the Commission in the last year, but also now, which has made this quite complex. But I think the need for a race reporting handbook in the media landscape that we are seeing and are operating in the last while is particularly critical, and that's why this was a really important project for MDA to, to be involved in.
Thanks so much. And just a note to folks on the call who've joined us as participants, you can use the chat box if you like to introduce yourself to each other, and also to ask any questions. If you post them there, I'll make sure that we get through them by the end of the hour. Mariam, we do have laws in Australia that are supposed to protect people from racism. There would be people who would say those laws are enough. In the same way that there are people who'd say that our laws against sexism mean that journalism can't possibly have a gender problem, which of course we know is not the case. So why isn't legislation enough when it comes to workplace prejudice?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, and as a former lawyer as well, I, huge respect for law and what it entails, but we know it's not enough. And so I guess in the context of the Race Reporting Handbook and what it's intended to do, it is intended to help lift the racial literacy of an industry who, based on MDA's research, indicates that there isn't a high percentage of people of racially diverse backgrounds, particularly in the top echelons of media. And so that level of racial literacy that perhaps comes with one's lived experience may not always be present, particularly at a leadership level. So it is about raising the minimum levels of racial literacy amongst this cohort who ultimately help shape the health of our democracy. And so irrespective of what laws are in place, you need, I guess, the approach has to come from all different angles. And with the media in particular, if that lived experience of race and racism isn't always there, or marginalisation, then they need to be able to get that information from somewhere if it's not in their lived experience. And so having lifting the racial literacy, hopefully of the sector through this race reporting handbook, is one step, not the only step, but one step to helping, I guess, get the levels of literacy to a point where we can have more nuanced coverage of issues relating to race. Because if we can see from examples and case studies in the actual handbook itself, that Jenae and Karina have done a fantastic job in curating, and Elias is also featured in the handbook. We can see from those examples and those case studies that when we get things wrong as a sector, the implications are enormous. And many marginalised communities are still paying the price of media coverage that has lacked nuance, and not just lacked nuance, but has actually been overtly racist. And so those consequences, leave their marks for decades. And so that's why we need to do better.
Thank you so much. Karina, Mariam has been talking there about racial literacy, and one of the goals of the handbook is to help journalists become racially literate. What does it mean? And what does it look like in practice?
Thanks, Corinne. And before I start, I just want to make sure that I acknowledge the traditional owners of where I'm calling in from today, and that's the Yugambeh people. I am a proud Aboriginal South Sea Islander woman, and that's incredibly important to me to make sure that that's done at the beginning, to acknowledge the people who have come before us. So I just wanted to do that, and then acknowledge all of the other people that have dialed in. And so when I think about being racially literate, I think about that thing of when I first started at the ABC 16 years ago, and I didn't realise that I was, or I carried a certain degree of knowledge that other people just didn't carry. Naturally, for me, like doing an acknowledgement is something that has been embedded in me from the day that I was born, even in my mum's womb, right? So for me, I just know that if I'm going into another country, or I'm speaking to people who are from another place, and I'm going into that place in some capacity, I need to know where I'm going, and why, and who it is that I could possibly reach out to build a bit of a relationship. And I didn't realise until I started at a big, white media organisation that wasn't second nature for people. I also didn't realise that it wasn't second nature for people to care about Aboriginal women and violence against Aboriginal women. I also didn't realise that, the reporting on people like my auntie Robbie Karina, who wrote a book called Strong Aboriginal Warrior, and I always like to mention that in these forums for the purpose of ensuring that people understand her story. That was very much sidelined, but is one of the biggest stories that have occurred when it comes to Aboriginal women and domestic violence in Australia. And so the fact that I didn't have that understanding, that people didn't care about those things, was problematic for me, because my expectation was that I was going to walk into an organisation that provided that, and that was true to its guidelines, which essentially is to represent the audience that they're speaking to. 16 years later, last week on Tuesday, I finished my career with the ABC, and to date, unfortunately, that's not something that ever sort of got dealt with while I was there. And we know about the ABC report and whatnot, but I guess what I'm saying about why it's important to understand and to be racially literate is because that I wanted to start that chat, or we wanted to include that chapter, because it's something that Jenae, well, I can't speak for Jenae, but that I guess some of us might at times take for granted, that people understand these things. And the reality is that the education system tells us, the legal system tells us, that disproportionately Indigenous people and people from multicultural backgrounds are disproportionately represented in those spaces. And so I guess the importance of being racially literate was really important, because people don't understand some of the really basics of it. right? And at times it can get lost in the conversation around diversity, equity, and inclusion and whatnot. And then you kind of lose that anti-racist approach, which I think is incredibly important. And so that chapter there was an opportunity to try and speak about some of those things and to make some of those things that are really obvious to me prominent to others. I hope that answered your question. I went around in a bit of a circle.
No, but context is everything, right? I think particularly for these sorts of issues, things that are not obvious to, you know, to those of us who don't identify as a particular thing, whether it's male or whether it's, you know, female, or whether it's a person of color, or, you know, it's trying to understand how the other person sees things, and always that involves more description, right? Otherwise, you're just coming at it from the perspective of assumption. So thanks for sharing.
Absolutely agree, and the criticality of language is important, and obviously there is a chapter in there about that as well. But you know, the language thing in itself is just important, because we don't all speak the same language quite literally, but then also in other ways, you know. So yeah.
And your mention of language brings us very nicely to a question I want to ask Jenae. Jenae, I know you're having some glitchiness with the connectivity, so let's see how it goes. My fingers are crossed. But the first chapter of the handbook looks at how we, journalists in Australia, collectively cover racialised communities. So the language we use, as well as the images and videos that we capture. So what, in a nutshell, and we'll talk more about the practical focus of the handbook in a minute, but what do journalists need to ask themselves before they go out on a story?
Brilliant. Thank you. Appreciate you for having me on here. And yes, I'd like to acknowledge the Younger and Terrible people from where I'm connecting from today. In the beginning of the book, Karina and I made a conscious decision to put some thought bubbles in the beginning that allows journalists to really critically think about who they are, where their place is and all, and why they do what they do. So some of the questions are, where am I situated in the media landscape? So are you brand new? Are you a senior, content director? And looking at, yes, what your role is on paper, but what else it can be additional to that to make sure that we are reducing harm and creating a positive in First Nation and racialized communities. We also asked, am I challenging my biases and educating myself? Because all of this diversity and inclusion training that is mandatory across organizations means nothing if we're not actually making small micro commitments every single day to be activating allyship, interrupting cultural stereotypes, and really understanding our biases and our privilege and our position in where we are. So the next couple of questions we added was, what is my level of lived experience? If you're going to do a story where there's a racialized community and you don't have a lived experience, that's totally fine. It doesn't mean that you can't do a story, but it does mean that you will be on the back foot of understanding that there will be perspectives potentially missed. And so you have to do more and have due diligence when it comes to figuring out what are you going to be missing. That comes with self-education, but that also requires you to do more than just ask questions of the community to answer. You have to be listening to them as well in your pre-interview, which should be a standard practice for journalists anyway. So extending your pre-interview process and really understanding, saying, look, I've done as much research as I can. I don't want to put the cultural load on you to teach me everything, but here's where I was going to go with the angle of the story. Is there something that I'm really missing here? Because I want to best represent the community and factually and equitably. So it's really about taking an interpersonal look before you jump to the story. And in media with the burn and churn, it's very easy to just step into a story. You want to beat your competitors, you want to get the story done, move on to the next. But unfortunately, that's where the damage can be done if we're not being intentional with every single word that we're putting in or not putting into the story and the angles that we take on those stories.
Thank you so much. Karina, there are these kinds of takeaways, the questions that, for example, people should ask themselves before they go out on a job is captured in a checklist. And this is a great moment to mention that there's an action-based checklist at the end of every chapter in the handbook. As an educator, I love that, because quite often I think guides to things in journalism are just prose. And then it's often, you know, sits on the shoulders of the person reading it to come up with, well, what do I do with this information now that you've shared that with me? So let's talk about chapter 2, which explores structural changes in newsrooms. What are some of the checklist items there? Because this is really going to the attention of, for example, hiring managers and HR departments. And I suppose just as context there, we've lost some great people from the industry in the last few years. And I think, you know, getting this right is becoming, you know, critically and visibly important.
So do you mind just repeating the question? Sorry,
Sure.
Karina.
No, that's okay. It was a bit all over the place. I shall ask.
No.
So, I mean, obviously the handbook has these wonderful checklists or takeaways at the end of each chapter. The second chapter is looking at structural changes in newsrooms. So not just what I need to ask myself when I go out on a job, but also what are some of the structural things that are required where I work. What are some of the key takeaways there, particularly for people who have hiring manager or HR roles?
Yeah, so you mentioned something to me before, context, and you said it's all good because it's all in context. And sometimes I do go for little walks and I do that. But I think that that does come back to that thing around that consultation process and the importance of ensuring, you know, that's being done in a culturally safe and appropriate way. But I guess for me, when I think about, you know, what editors and managers and content managers and directors can learn from this book around improved consultation, which I think is the question, is that there's this thing around time I'm kind of flopping about, but there's this thing around time and deadlines that quite often get pushed on you from a mainstream perspective. Like in a newsroom, and it's totally understandable to a degree that, you know, you need to ensure that you have a story ready for the 2 p.m. bulletin. But I think for me, what this tries to do is to get people to look at time in a little bit of a different kind of way, and I mean that in the way that you know, these relationships that I have with my community and with communities from the multicultural background are ones that I've built from the day that I've been born, right? And so what this looks at is how it is and what it is that we can do in it to invest, you know, in better time management, I guess, to ensure that, you know, when that story does arise, you can call on that person in a second, you know, understanding things like, and there's a real life example for us, you know, with Jenae and I, we're about to go and do some interviews about our podcast this afternoon that we won an award for. And the person that we did the podcast with is a Aboriginal elder in the community, an Aboriginal elder who we've both worked with, but over time for us, it's been more than a job and just showing up and building this thing. It's been about building the relationship. And it's because of the building of that relationship that I knew exactly where she was at the time and what was going on in her family. And it just so happens that there was some sorry business at the time. And I guess the point of me telling you this is that, you know, between Thursday and today, her being in Cairns then, and we've managed to be able to pull that together, and we'll meet at the ABC in a couple of hours and do that. But that requires a lot of trust, because, you know, an elder doesn't want to spend time with 2 people they don't know or who don't care about the fact that she may have lost someone in her family, right? So yeah, I think for me that part of the handbook is about understanding that relationship building process and that consultation process, and thinking about it through a lens that isn't underpinned by this Western notion of getting shit done, to be frank, because that's really just a really intellectually lazy way of looking at time. I think if we can build a culture and build relationships in a meaningful way, that can have really long-term positive outcomes in the media landscape and right across Australia. Yeah.
And what about policies specifically around staff retention? As I mentioned, you know, we've had some brilliant people who've left the industry after experiencing racism in their newsrooms. So really sort of addressing that question, what needs to change to retain racialised journalists? And what does that look like in terms of workplace policies and practice?
Yeah, like I think that kind of is a perfect segue into, I remember hearing a speech done at the Women in Media conference that possibly most of you are at, and there was a question around, why hasn't there been more Indigenous people or no Indigenous people in the leadership team at the ABC? And the response was because they don't exist, or if they're not applying for it and they're not out there, then that's not my fault. That's a lie. That's an
I think Karina might have frozen just while she's returning.
Lie. We're out there.
No, she's back. So you froze for a second there. We lost you at that's a lie. So did you want to sort of pick up from there?
Oh, okay. The notion that we don't exist and that we're not out there is actually not true. So I was the second Indigenous cadet at the ABC. There's well over 160 now, 14 years later. But understanding that getting the numbers up and getting them in is only one part of the strategy. When I think about workforce development, and I do sit on boards, so I have a different take on things, and I can zoom out and look at things from that perspective. And I think it's important is that keeping people and ticking a box are two very different things. And again, I think it comes back to that relationship building thing. And that's something that for me, I think is innate for me. It's something I've grown up with, is building relationships in a certain way and actually having responsibility within that relationship. And I think the boards or the organizations I've worked with that have done this the best, whether it's a hospital board, whether it's an engineering board, or whether it's a dance board, and I'm on all three, when we speak about retention, it comes back to that relationship thing and understanding how to look at a relationship, not through as a commodified kind of thing, but rather as a human thing, right? And then also being robust and strategic enough to then take that and turn that into a really good policy or guideline that then can lead us forward. Sadly, like for example, at the ABC, they've only just got their first senior First Nations strategic lead, Callie Williams. Fantastic, loving it. It's taken 93 years, and she's only in there temporarily. And we know that the report only recently got released. So fantastic to see that Cal's in there. But what does that mean long term? And what does that mean for the quality of what it is like to work within a big racist organization? And so I think grappling with all those things and thinking about retention, there are so many different layers, right? Like so many layers, the board layer, the senior executive layer, the workforce layer, the external layer, who's in politics at any one time. But the retention thing, I think when you look at it as a human thing rather than just a set of standards or a set of expectations of staff, and it starts to become a living thing, you do see these organizations benefit from that. And I'd like to see that better in the media industry. The fact is from a governance perspective, I see the media industry as being so incredibly behind in the media industry when it comes to anti-racism and racial literacy.
Does anyone else want to? Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to speak over you.
No.
I was just wondering if anyone else wanted to hop on to the question of approaches to retention, to retain racialised journalists before we move on. Mariam or Jenae or Elias?
Well, Mariam, I'm not sure, or Elias, I'm not sure if you want to jump in there, but I think it's like Karina said, it's not just about representation. A lot of times we go, oh, we need to increase it by 10%, 3%, whatever it is. But what my concern is once a new journo has been recruited and they're from a racialized background, what their experience is on the ground. Are we listening to the experiences of discrimination and racism? Are we debating them when they come to you and tell you, this is my experience and it's been harmful? Are you debating them on that? Because we know that racism is not a debatable topic, that's dehumanizing. So that is their experience. So are we actually listening and critically analyzing what we're doing? If somebody challenges content director or content creation teams to diversify our stories, are we telling them, oh, we've already got a First Nation story today? Or are we actually saying, great, we can add more, let's look at that? At the end of each week, are we really analyzing how many stories have gone out, who gets to tell those stories, and what the experiences were, not only for the consumer, but for the journalist and those who are creating it? What is the consultation process, and what is it? Are we co-designing the culture in the organization with people from racialized backgrounds? I think a lot of times people forget that we got a PhD in living from a racial, like I say, I got a PhD in living Black, so I know what my experience is and my family and so on and so forth. So if I come to you with some insight, look at that like a gem of insight on how we can improve things rather than feeling like you're being attacked. And let's co-design and work together on that, because the matter of the fact is a lot of journalists are leaving. They don't feel respected, heard, valued, seen. Their contributions are either overlooked or someone else is doing the exact same thing that they suggested the week prior and they're not getting acknowledged. And so it's really about the experience. You can raise your numbers all that you want to, but what is happening with the experience there? So when it comes to retaining, I think it really is, like Karina said, that human element of working with those new journos, listening to them and taking the feedback on board quite seriously, not as a venture of attack, but more of a way to better the organization. There's also not an HR problem only. This is a whole systemic issue. Holistically, we all have to make a commitment. It can't just be put on one person in HR to do that work. And 9 times out of 10, you don't really get to speak to the person in HR anyway. It's usually your content directors or your managers and your colleagues that you're dealing with day to day. So the other thing I would suggest is having, we have the EA, employee assistance program. Do those people on the other end have a lived experience of being racialized or discrimination or racism? If they do not, there's nothing that I can tell them that they're going to be able to help me with if they don't have an understanding of racism. And there is this feeling of loneliness. So there needs to be more support in place for people for journalists from a racialized background. And currently that's not there.
Thank you. Anyone else before we move on? Crack on. Okay, so we've been talking quite a bit about lived experience of racism. I haven't got lived experience of racism because I'm a white person. And so this is a really wonderful opportunity for me to say, what can those of us who are not on the receiving end of racism do better to support our colleagues and peers who do? Jenae, do you want to have first crack at that, and then we can go around and anyone else who wishes to speak to it?
Sure. So a concept that I'm really passionate about is allyship. So my business Expand Your Library, we work within schools and early childhood education as well as organizations. So we're teaching 3-year-olds around activating allyship, and they can understand the importance of that after an hour of being with me. And allyship is vital. It's not just some fun term. It's actually something that is an interpersonal commitment that we must take. And so allyship is in layers. So if someone in your team or in your organization has experienced racism and you've heard it, you've seen it, you've witnessed it, we need to be aware of and recognize the systemic inequities. So, and understanding what are those structural inequities, and where are our privileges within that system that we're benefiting from. And if we don't understand that, then that's a great opportunity to educate ourselves on how where our position is. I think the next part of allyship is acknowledgement, like listen to and understand your colleagues' experiences. Like I said, remove yourself from the center and don't debate it, and kind of go, okay, what are you feeling? Even if you've never experienced, like the perfect examples, if someone comes to you and says, I don't know, Bob has treated me this way, and they have trust to tell you that that's their experience, but you've never had a negative experience with Bob. That doesn't mean that Bob's not able to cause harm to somebody else. It just means that your experience with Bob is completely different to your colleague. So we must listen and validate their experience and remove ourselves from the center of that experience. Advocacy is the next step, and it's speaking up and doing something about it. Too often we are in meetings, someone's getting talked over multiple times, they're getting spoken to disrespectfully, their story doesn't get up multiple times, and we do nothing about it. Allyship can take different forms. You might go and say, hey, look, I heard that happened in the meeting. I'm sorry that happened. But that will make that person feel like you care, but that won't change the system, and that will happen to that person in the next meeting. So what can you do? Can you start to document these incidents and then put forth like a bit of a report to say, hey, look, I've noticed this has happened multiple times. I'm bringing it to you. Can you speak up in that moment? That's what an ally does, is that they're actually walking alongside the person in that moment, and it's moving away from passive allyship into active allyship. Keeping yourself accountable is the next part of allyship, understanding that we make mistakes, and that's me included. I never proclaim to know it all. So being okay and open to feedback and criticism, re-educating yourself. I like to say going back to the drawing board when I've made a mistake. And I think a perfect example is Karina and I's journey with a younger elder for the podcast that we're working on. Just because Karina is an Aboriginal South Sea Islander woman and I'm an African-American woman with lived experience of we both have experience of racism, doesn't mean we don't get it wrong. We have got it wrong, but we're open to feedback and criticism and going, okay, we need to work on that. Apologies and doing better. So commitment to self. So I think it's just about what can you do? What small commitments can you do each day to improve your interactions with others, to reduce harm? Understanding that if you're seeing something and hearing something and you choose to ignore it because it's uncomfortable for you, that is basically the standards we choose to ignore, the standards we choose to live by. And so your short-term, and when I say you, I'm not meaning you, Karina, I mean just anyone in general. If you're uncomfortable for a short period of time, but can move past that to be an ally, that will actually have long-term benefits for the other person. And in turn, going back to your attention question, will potentially could keep someone in that organization just one day longer. You know?
Thank you so much. Would others like to share?
To
Yeah,
that?
please, Karina. Go
Is
ahead.
it okay? Like when Jenae, you just said about the allyship thing. So at the moment, Jenae and I are both being allies ourselves, because Annie Carey, like Jenae just mentioned, is a Yagara woman. I don't come from here. This isn't my country. These aren't my protocols. So Jenae and I have had to exercise a degree of allyship with Annie Carey, right? And so, as you guys may know, like things like native title and things like repatriation of language or repatriation of protocol, that type of stuff is steeped into some really heavy, deep stuff, and it can be quite challenging, particularly native title. And quite often, I'll find with mob, like, who aren't from here, they'll go, oh, look, it's just black politics, or it's just black politics. Well, actually, it's not just a squabble in the corner, right? This is colonization. And so I've had to fight with these things to go, do I just step away and not say anything? Or do I actually stand up and do something as a non-Yagara woman on Yagara country? And so therefore, like, we work to understand the culture, but we also, I'll cop it on the chin. If I make a mistake, and I have, Annie Carey will let me know. And I take that as an honor, and a privilege. And once we can move away from this thing of blame and punishment and punitive stuff that is so, Australia loves that stuff, into a space of understanding and cohesiveness rather, and we come from that place, then these are the things you start to learn in your journey. And it's like getting started, like, this booklet is one part of the journey. It's one part. It's up to each person to take that and apply that to their own experience. Yeah.
Thank you. Elias, did you want to speak to that?
Sorry, I had myself on mute there. I think I can't really add much more. I think both Karina and Jenae have hit the nail on the head there. I think yeah, it's just important for people to listen and to have empathy in these environments. And there should be a really strong emphasis on that in any working environment. When that erodes, that's when issues start to arise. I think, managers need to be very attentive to ensuring that that culture within a newsroom or any environment is maintained. And when you don't have, I guess, a particularly diverse newsroom, it's very easy for that to just dissipate. So, sorry if that's a sort of convoluted answer, but I think it's important that real focus is homed in on and maintained.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not just something that's a flash in the pan. Okay, this is our policy now. We're going to do this. We're going to ensure this happens. We're going to ensure culturally we've got things right, and that just doesn't erode over time.
Yeah, and it moves as well, right? Because culture is not static.
Exactly.
Yeah. I just wanted to come back briefly, Jenae, to you, and then Elias, there's a couple of questions I want to ask you. But Jenae, Chapter 2 introduces a word, intersectionality, which I think is very familiar to folks studying race and racism in the US, but perhaps maybe less familiar here. What does it mean, and why does it matter in journalism?
Yeah, so intersectionality was a term coined by Kimberly Williams Crenshaw in 1989. She did a research paper on how Black women in America, or African American women in America, face double discrimination, say, than a white American woman. You've got sexism and then racism. And so a white American woman would face sexism, a Black American woman would face racism and sexism. And so it's really been a great way for us to understand that, or a way for us to explore how some people, and most people, actually everybody, faces a level of intersectionality of their identity and how that shapes your experience in the world. So, understanding identity and its relationship to power and systems that are in play. And so I might go for a job. I think Elias and I share the same sentiment. We were talking about how Elias said in his speech at the launch of this book that he applied for to be a journo like hundreds of times. And I was like, dude, me too. But then you talk to other people who are not racialized, and their entrance into the media industry was a lot different and usually a little bit easier. And so that's because you've got that level of intersectionality of a intellectual, smart person, but you've got race that kind of jumps in the way, and people's bias play out, and they may or may not decide to hire you. So we may need to apply for a job 100 times over, where someone else might need to apply for 2 or 3 jobs. And that's how intersectionality plays out. It's important for journalists to know that a lot of times when we go to do a story with someone from a racialized community, we expect them to lead with culture only and first. I've got degrees, I'm a parent, I work in education. There's more to me than just the color of my skin or my cultural background or whatever whatever box someone wants to put me in. And understanding we're not a homogenous group. So my experience as a woman of color is completely different to the next woman of color. And so when we hear, oh, we've already got a story from that community, okay, and we need to go, great, there's more to add, because everybody has different stories to tell and different experiences to share, and we don't all agree. So just because Elias and I may look the same skin tone, we may not agree on a lot of things. We're not, and we're not all in the same box, but a lot of times we're put in the same box. So I think that's really important for journalists to really kind of grapple with, is like starting with self. Okay, Karina, you said, you're a white woman and you haven't experienced racism, but you've got intersectionality of layers to you that I wouldn't know, that I'd need to work to understand your experience of how you see the world and how you navigate the world, right? And it will be different from another woman, a white woman in Australia. And I have to have empathy and compassion and understanding to that. And so that's why journalists need to really understand intersectionality is vital. Someone from a racialized background should not only be called upon to speak about culture, and sometimes they don't even want to speak about culture. They have a doctorate degree and they want to speak about what are other things that's relevant. So and understanding how that plays within power systems as well. And so a First Nation woman or a Black woman from a racialized community, let's look at their education, their socioeconomic background, their other experiences that come into play as to how that person or that community is in that position, and the historical context behind that as well. It all comes into play.
Thank you.
If I may extend on that a bit, Karina, I was just going to say that further to what Jenae said, sometimes it's not a cultural issue, but the newsroom will make it a cultural issue. So, for example, raising the age, that's not an Indigenous issue, albeit that we are represented at a disproportionate rate. That's an issue for everybody, right? Anyone can go to jail at the age of 10. But I had a prominent journalist 2 weeks ago at a gathering in Melbourne that I had 10 Indigenous journalists come together to talk about how we report on violence against Aboriginal women. She said that story she had presented along with the death of an Aboriginal woman, and they said, because there's 2 Indigenous stories, we can't do it. Well, actually, raising the age is not an Indigenous story. It affects us disproportionately, but it's not. So do you see? Yeah.
Yeah.
And
it's a really important distinction to make. I wanted to come to you, Elias, in terms of chapter 4 of the handbook, which looks at inclusive storytelling. Your coverage of the Black Lives Matter protests in Melbourne 4 years ago is mentioned in the handbook as a case study. And there's quite a bit to unpack. So first, the temptation, which I think we're hearing from Jenae a bit there about from a news editor, that perhaps to send a journalist out on a story about a racial minority or a story about racism because they are a person of colour. And in the handbook, we hear how you were initially uncomfortable about covering the protests and then changed your mind. So there's quite a bit to sort of draw out there. I'd love to hear a bit about that from you.
In terms of why I was reluctant to initially cover the story?
Yes, and why you changed your mind, and then what's the teachable moment for folks who have joined the session today? Yeah.
Well, I mean, the reason why I was initially reluctant was because as journalists, and people on the panel would be very familiar with this, as soon as you walk in the door, I started in commercial radio when I was 19. As soon as you walk in the door, you are taught, and it's drilled into you, that any story that you are emotionally invested in is not something you shouldn't go out of your way to cover it, because that will mean you'll even inadvertently insert your own personal bias into the story, and you'd be incapable of being impartial. And so with that in mind, and that drilled into me over, at that point, I'd sort of been a journalist for maybe 7 or 8 years, perhaps a little bit longer. But with that in mind, I sort of thought, well, this is an experience that I'm living. I was very emotional about this kind of groundswell movement. And I was very reflective about my own life, about my own experience, some of it my own experience in the media. And I just felt that being a journalist, it wouldn't be appropriate for me to be emotionally invested or have an emotional attachment tethering to the story. I changed my mind, though, after I saw a cross that a CNN reporter did with a Channel 9 anchor in Sydney, and she was asked a question, when will the rioting, or when will this violence stop? And she said, it stops when I still get emotional thinking about it. It stops when the racism stops. There's no end in sight, essentially, is what she was saying. She was an African-American woman. And it was such a profound piece of journalism. I thought that there's someone who's not expressing any kind of imbalance in the story. It was perfectly down the line, but she perfectly encapsulated the moment, the feeling, and it was really impactful, powerful journalism. And I thought to myself, there's a Black woman who understands the moment perfectly. And I'm just speculating, but I'm sure she felt an emotional attachment to the story, but was able to use that to deliver a really important piece of journalism. And so that watching that, really, it was a complete shift, really, in terms of my entire career, because I started to see stories like the Black Lives Matter movement. I started to see it as an opportunity for me to use lived experience as a means of delivering impactful journalism. What I guess I can offer, and people on this panel today can offer from an editorial sense, is a real level of expertise and an understanding of the real nuances within a story like that. And our responsibilities as journalists are to not just deliver the facts, but to really ensure that people understand the nuance and the complexities of the story to make it more impactful, right? And so I sort of figured, well, if I have all of this lived experience and all of this knowledge of this particular movement, my mum's African American, I used to live in the US, have, grown up within multicultural communities. I have a really strong understanding of this issue. And it doesn't mean that when I'm writing the story that I'm just going to be, completely biased and completely, just writing what I personally believe about this specific issue. What it means is that I can, keep going back to it, I can bring in expertise that perhaps someone else can't.
Mm-hmm.
If that CNN reporter didn't have that lived experience, I don't think she would have answered the question of when would this violence end quite like she did. It might have been something like, well, I've spoken to so-and-so and they say, when this happens, we might see, an end within a couple of weeks or something. But instead, it was something much more poignant than that, much more salient. So, that was really the lesson I took from that. And it's a kind of approach I now take into my reporting broadly.
And if I may, I mean, there's a mindset there that you've come to. A follow-up question I wanted to ask, though, is what would you say to editors who might assume that because someone is diverse and they have lived experience or they have an understanding of it, that they should cover diversity issues, which is often the case, that, people will be hired because they represent a diverse community or a racialized community that perhaps need more coverage, and then they're the person that was always asked to cover it. What would you say to those editors to do that in a more nuanced, compassionate, sensible way?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I think just broadly bringing someone in because of the color of their skin, hoping to kind of fill a gap that they might have or a blind spot that they might have in their editorial output is a very anachronistic way of the hiring process. I think you obviously need to diversify newsrooms, and I think thankfully that's happening more and more. But ultimately, we should be, I guess there should be an understanding of what each journalist can deliver and provide, and certainly a manager having a conversation with people within their team saying, look, what specific cultural issues would you feel comfortable reporting on? I think that's a really important conversation to have. But also acknowledging that sometimes covering issues of race for people can be, traumatic, can trigger horrible memories and be very emotional. And so obviously that, and certainly I can speak to that. There are stories that certainly if I was asked to cover would, I'd sort of, but by the same token, I think, I just think it's important for a newsroom, just in a broad sense, to understand that any issues out there that involve race need to be covered with with this idea of providing nuance, context, and impact. And it should be up to a manager to determine how best they can deliver that. But too often we see stories that have a very homogenous sort of sense of, okay, I spoke about it recently when it was when we had this issue around so-called Sudanese gangs in Melbourne. And too often we saw a very homogenous idea of, okay, we have an issue with young black kids getting involved in crime. And that was for someone working in the industry, that was just a prime example of people not understanding, particularly editorial managers, not having an understanding of how to cover these issues with context and nuance. Instead, if they had people in the newsroom that understood these issues within the community, you would have more coverage around, well, there's a lot of white kids that commit crime as well. Why aren't we focusing on that? The lived experience of Sudanese young people coming to this country is quite extraordinary. You know, the fact that a few people are, 15-year-olds are breaking into houses or whatever, shouldn't we try and understand what the cause is? Is it racism in the community? Is it a sense of, I did a story on the amount of depression due to post-traumatic stress. A lot of Sudanese people who had escaped just extraordinary hardship were faced with living in Australia. It was going untreated for years. And so these are all these different aspects to a story that was really just given a very simplistic treatment, particularly in Melbourne. And so with diversity in newsrooms, it's important to have those discussions about ensuring that we don't sort of go down this road, which can lead to very, I don't want to use the word racist, but it can lead to very kind of one-dimensional outlook on our community, particularly when it comes to people of colour. Sorry, that's a very kind of long-winded answer, but I hope it.
No, it's excellent. And again, it's context, right? I think one thing that perhaps many years ago, I did a kind of a gap year in South Carolina in the US at a black-run station. And one of the things that was really useful for me to understand, was to, I think right at the very beginning of this webinar, the idea of individual bias was brought up. And I think it's really healthy for every person, I think, to say what biases or what assumptions am I making about my fellow human beings on this planet, and understanding that everybody is an individual. That, Jenae, you would have things in common with people who, even with your siblings, and then there'd be things that are quite different, for example. And similarly, I've got two sisters, and there are ways in which we're very similar, and then there are ways in which we're very different. And we have the same, many of the same experiences. And I think something else that I'll mention that was really useful for me to hear, this was in the early 90s, was that if you live in a smoky room, you're going to smell. And so understanding that, beliefs about, different people and people of different backgrounds or different colors or so on is part of the wallpaper of our lives. And so just assuming that there are individual biases that I don't always know what they are because I live in a smoky room, so I'm going to stink like everybody, and trying to look for those actively maybe was something that I learned.
I love that analogy. And I think that speaks to the book. We wanted to be really intentional about it. And we really wanted to, alongside like Mariam and Jenae, like kind of point out the obvious things in a way that wasn't condescending, but that was like, this is actually not translating in the newsroom the way we need it to. Yeah. And so therefore, here's an intentional set of things that you can go out and you can do.
Yeah.
I think in a sense too.
And they may be obvious to you, Karina, but they may not be obvious to somebody else just because of their, I'm going to jump ahead because we have a whole 6 minutes, and the handbook starts with, why should you read this? And I wonder if we could just go around each of you to share why you want journalists to read it, or why you think they should read it, and then what you want them to do with it. So if that's okay, and that may almost take us to the end of the session. So perhaps we could start with our wonderful authors, and then Elias and Mariam come to you guys to close out. Is that okay? Yep. So Karina, why should people read this, and what do you want people to do with it?
Oh golly, I'm always so philosophical, I think sometimes, but you know, in all seriousness, like, you know, and I get fairly emotional about this stuff, right? Because my experience with violence has been plentiful, to say the least. And I lost my sister in a very violent way as well last year, and that was incredibly difficult. And grief has been really difficult. I don't want you to walk away thinking of me through a deficit lens, but rather to know that my experience with grief, and the reason why I think that people need to read this stuff, is because we're actually just not doing a good enough job of telling the stories of absolutely everybody.
Yeah.
We're just not. We are falling well and truly behind the 8 ball. And research by people like Deb Bargelli, who fed into that racial literacy module, and other amazing scholars have spoken to that, you know. But fundamentally, I'd love you to read it for all of those missing and murdered Aboriginal women that never got the coverage that they should have gotten. And today, a really important report was released in the Northern Territory around the inquest into that. And I think for me, that is that. Please go, everybody on here, please go and make yourself aware of that report. And then once you do, then hopefully you'll understand, you know, that particular piece and the work that people like Bridget Brennan and Brooke Fryer, Kylie Cripps, Marlene Longbottom, all these deadly Indigenous women. And I know that this is multicultural as well, of course, but I speak about that because of my experience. But all those deadly women have really made an intentional decision to do this in a very authentic way. Like everyone that's involved in doing this stuff, you know, have met over years and years and years. This is something that is like, that is a daily thing for me that I work on, you know. And so for me, that's why I think every single person should read this book that is in the media industry and should in some capacity be working towards just being better in that respect.
Thank you, Karina. Jenae?
Yeah, I think this, can you hear me?
Yes.
It was glitching. This book, this guide is just one tool that can add to the conversation and keep the dialogue moving forward. Inclusive reporting just shouldn't be like a goal or something we try to do. It is our responsibility. If you are taking on the role or the job as working in media or being a content creator in the media or a journalist, it's your responsibility to do your due diligence and make sure you're reporting equitably, fairly, responsibly, especially when it comes to reporting on race, because the human decisions we make can either add value to someone's life or severely deduct from it. And it's bigger than just a story that goes out and you build your bulletin for the next day, right? Like I just spoke on a panel about racism in Australian schools. It is absolutely rife at the moment. It is affecting our entire community and the next generation. And so when we add to those stereotypes, we are just cementing in bad habits and behavior that's not bettering or moving our society forward. At the launch of this guide, Professor Kevin Dunn from Western Sydney University said that diversity is no longer a box ticking exercise, and denial is the first inhibitor of change. And so we have to really, just like Karina said, the data is there, the lived experience and harmful stories are there, journos are leaving at a ridiculous rate. The evidence is all there. So what are we going to do about it? It's time to kind of face the facts and try to be better individually and collectively. Really would hope that people would print out at least the checklist. I know journos are busy and we burn and churn every day, but it shouldn't excuse for societal laziness. Like I said, it's our responsibility to do right. So read the book from front to back if you can, take your time, but then print off the checklist, have it at your desk, and go back to the basics. Really ask yourself, why did you come into the industry? I know I came into the industry to better tell stories of modern Australia and to elevate voices of those who are marginalized. So if that was your intention, or if your intention is your love of storytelling, go back to the basics, slow down, tell the story with intention, love, and care. And it doesn't have to be just, you know, mindless pumping out of stories. You're not a robot, right? So bring back that human element into storytelling and understand that the words and the images that you use or don't use can either positively or negatively affect somebody, and can you sleep at night knowing that you may be causing harm to the next person? If you can, I'm not sure if this is the industry for you, but hopefully you can be a bit more aware about your responsibility in the industry. And the last thing I want to say is, once again, every time I'm near Elias or can speak to Elias, I always thank him for what he did for the Black Lives Matter movement, and that's why I included it in the guide. It's because Elias is the reason why I'm stayed on for another few more years in the industry, because I was benched at that moment. I didn't get that opportunity. And so just for your CNN presentation, you were my presentation, Elias, and I was like, I can stay here, I can tell stories, I can do this, I'm meant to be here. So thank you for having the courage to do that. And it's so great you had management that worked with you and gave you the autonomy to kind of pick and choose what stories you told. You told it so beautifully, and I can't ever talk about it without getting emotional, but I just want to thank you for what you've done. It's really important.
Thanks for those amazing words. Really appreciate it. And all the work you've done is quite spectacular, and we're all very appreciative of it. So yeah, thank you. I'm getting emotional as well. They didn't tell me we'd cry on this thing. What's going on?
Wow, because we're talking about the deep stuff, the stuff that helps us as an industry do this all better. Just briefly, Elias, what would you being featured in the handbook as a case study, what would you want people? Why would you want people to read it? And what do you want people? More to the point, what do you want people to do with it?
Look, I think just quickly, two things. I think in a kind of broader sense, people should look at it because, again, all the things we've spoken about today, we need to approach stories with, as Jenae was saying, a bit more love, a bit more understanding, a bit more will to get into the nuance and the complexities. But I just wanted to take perhaps a different tact, and I mentioned this a few weeks ago. I spoke at Western Sydney University, and just the commercial aspect of it. So a manager or an editor at a newsroom should look at this, because we're constantly hearing about the decline in audiences across the media industry, and habits are changing, and we know that. But we haven't really discussed the fact that whether this decline has been accelerated in part because for generations, for years, we have completely ignored large swathes of the community and not covered issues important to them with any care at all. Newsrooms have had a very narrow, myopic outlook on who reads the news and who I guess deserves to be covered. We need to go back and understand contemporary Australia is much different, and we need to understand as newsrooms that we have to try and reach more people, and by doing that we need to tell impactful stories about different communities. And I think the guys have done an amazing job making that very clear in the handbook. So I think it's really important for editors to get an understanding of that.
Thank you so much. And Mariam, what do you want people to do with this in 2025? Like, it's only just come out last month. If we were looking back at this maybe a year from now, what would you have liked to have happen as a result of this handbook?
Thank you. And I'm conscious that we're running over time, so I'll be really quick. The chapter that is the headline is why you should read this. One of the things it quotes is there's a quote in there that journalism doesn't merely reflect reality, it shapes different interpretations of it. And I think the media and the journalism sector needs to recognise how significant that role is in shaping interpretations of it. And so really what the book tries to also do is provide examples where the inclusion and exclusion of voices, the use of images, the use of certain words, the way things are framed, that they can have broader implications. And so whilst newsrooms may think these are micro decisions they're making every day at an operational level, they have huge macro consequences. And if the handbook just raises awareness about those macro consequences and then inspires and encourages and I guess also holds people accountable to make better micro decisions that recognise the nuance, and to all the points that Elias, Jenae and Karina have made. I'm so proud of these three. It's so incredible, the journey through the Race Reporting Handbook, and that MDA in partnership with the Human Rights Commission was able to produce this Race Reporting Handbook. And the final thing I'd say is I am the former executive MDA, but we have a wonderful person, former ABC News journalist, Paula Krug, coming into that role starting in February. And I would love for those online and the broader media sector to really get behind Paula and continue supporting the really important work of Media Diversity Australia. It's such critical work that it has able to bring us, put a spotlight on this issue through the Race Reporting Handbook, and help spotlight some of the people that you're seeing on this call, such incredibly talented, critical voices in the sector that really should hold leadership positions. And I have hope that they will in future. And so that as a sector, we can do better to actually, not have to have an organisation called Media Diversity Australia or a Race Reporting Handbook, so that we can get to a point where we can actually report on these issues inclusively and in a nuanced way. But until we get to that point, these things are so critical. And thank you, Corinne, to you in particular for bringing this conversation, and to the Walkley Foundation for hosting this. We're so grateful.
My
Mariam,
pleasure.
Prime Minister. Sorry.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mariam, as well, for your leadership in this space. I know you're stepping away, but it really were the driving force in making sure that this happened and got the eyes onto this guide, and continue to push and support us. There's also training attached to this book that is being launched in 2025 with Media Diversity Australia, Div Pillay for Mind Tribes, and myself as well. And Karina, so please reach out. But honestly, Mariam, really appreciate your leadership on this and ensuring that
I'm glad you did it, Mariam. It was a long road, but it was worth it.
Thank you, guys.
Well, dear friends, I will just wrap there. Thank you to those of you who joined us today, and to our wonderful 4 speakers. So the authors of the Race Reporting Handbook, Jenae, Tien and Karina Hogan, Elias Klur, who joined us, he's with the ABC 7:30 program, and of course Mariam Veiszadeh, former CEO of Media Diversity Australia. I'm so grateful to everybody for your time today. Thanks so much, and have a wonderful day.